Hello, it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Kwasi Tieku, whose article is joint winner of the Review of International Studies annual prize for the best article published by the journal in 2021. Thomas is an associate professor of political science at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and his research focuses on, amongst other things, informal international politics, international organizations, mediation, and African politics. And his article, The Legon School of International Relations, was published in Review of International Studies, volume 47, number 5, which is a special issue on the multiple origins of international relations and looks at various different origin stories and for the discipline of international relations that might have been neglected by orthodox understandings of the discipline. And there's a link to the article in the notes accompanying this video, and I strongly encourage everybody to go and read it. It's a really fascinating article. The article explores the Legon School of International Relations at the University of Ghana, Legon, and Thomas shows that the Legon School came out of attempts to decolonize knowledge production, dissemination, and academic programming in Ghana in the early 1960s, and was grounded in Southern epistemologies. It was relational in ontology and qualitative in methodology, practice-based and equity-oriented. It's a fascinating discussion about how a particular kind of understanding of IR emerged in a particular kind of place and time and institution. And it really highlights the value of paying close attention to the works of IR, particularly works of IR that originate in Africa. And the judges were glowing in their praise for this article. They wrote a long citation commendation, which you can read in the notes below, and I encourage you to. It gives a real sense of the sort of importance of the article. But I just wanted to highlight a kind of comment they made at the end of their commendation, which is that many scholars of the discipline talk as if there is one history of IR, but there are indeed many. And this excellent article offers not only a recovery of one such story, but a path-breaking analysis of the gains of recovering those stories. Its originality, quality of prose, and clarity of argumentation make it a clear choice for IR syllabi and reading lists. And I really kind of want to kind of stress that this is a really kind of well-written discussion that recovers something that we don't really tell in sort of orthodox stories of international relations, and I really encourage everybody to read it. So it's a real pleasure to talk to Thomas about it today. And I wanted to start by just asking what led you to write about the topic, and how did you become interested in the Legon School in the first place?
Thank you, Martin, for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. The first one is that this is part of my broader interest and that of some of our colleagues to try to bring different experiences and insight from around the world to enrich and to enhance the discipline of international relations. But specifically the Legon School, the interest in the Legon School was developed when I was a visiting professor as or the diaspora fellow at the University of Ghana in 2019. In a very typical fashion, when you go to a new place, you want to understand the history of the place. So I started reading around or trying to catch up on intellectual history of Ghana in particular, and political science. And then I find a very innocuous kind of a footnote somewhere where the writer had indicated that Ghana was the place to be in the 50s and in the 60s. If you were a critical political scientist or political scientist, and I said, wow, if Ghana was a place for critical political scientists, then perhaps there must have been some form of decolonial IR or some form of IR that was taught during that particular. So I started digging into that intellectual history, and I found fascinating discussion during that particular period with scholars from India, UK, and elsewhere, critical scholars, including in Fanon, even here in the 70s and in the 60s and in the 50s, pushing for particular critical ways of thinking about the world during that particular period. And that's how the Legon School, and I started piecing together the narrative, and that's how the story, the article came about.
Yeah, and I think you do. I mean, the article is a really interesting story about how what we think of as decoloniality actually has other origins elsewhere, and at times well before we think about the kind of the sort of the Western history of decoloniality as a term. So I think it's really fascinating. You show that really well. So tell us a bit about, if people haven't read the article, what are the sort of the central kind of sort of arguments that you make, the things that that they need to know?
Okay. I think the first one, those of you who have not read it, the first thing that you need to know is that it is decolonial in theoretical perspective, in the sense that it seeks to center Southern voices in the IR scholarship. And it's not just only Ghanaian, or in most cases, they were not even talking about Ghanaian voices. It was African voices and that of the Southern voices in international relations. So that's the first one. The second one is that it also grounded in Southern epistemologies, to the extent that it sought to focus much more on the oppressed group in international system and the knowledge that seeks to legitimize this oppression within the international system, which I find it very fascinating. So kind of an attempt, decolonial, or the struggle to not just only decolonize Africa, but also decolonize knowledge that legitimizes that oppression. It is also relational in ontology, and the emphasis is not just on the state. Perhaps maybe the African state had not been built, and therefore it couldn't emphasize on the state, but the emphasis on regions and the broader entities and the relationship between those broader entities, which I find it fascinating that those broader entities, in other words, is a relationship, the interlinkages between those relationships, that intersectionality is the one that the school places much more emphasis at the expense of placing on individual actors within the international system. I also found that it's more qualitative, although they talk a little bit about quantitative, but in most cases, most of the scholars are, to some extent, empiricists and qualitative researchers in their orientation. And then I also found that there was a very close between diplomatic practices and that of the way the Legon School theorized or thought about international. There's an attempt to make sure that theory is very much more closely linked with the practice in the international system. And finally, is that the Legon School of IR seeks to promote equitable global order, in particular, equitable distribution of power within the international system, which perhaps not surprising, given that there was a talk at that time of a new international order where developing countries, that would give developing countries much more greater say in international affairs. So that's a nutshell, that's what the Legon School is all about.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's a fascinating story you tell about sort of the way in which the school brings in scholars, not just from, not just from sort of Africa, but also kind of wider scholars in this kind of decolonial moment where they're building these kinds of senses about what the decolonial or the decolonized state will look like and so on. It's a really fascinating story. And this link between theory and sort of diplomacy, I think, is also interesting, but also grounded in this kind of, this sort of equitable politics. It's a really fascinating story. So you mentioned sort of Southern epistemologies, you mentioned sort of, sort of decolonization. How does the work coming out of the Legon School sort of challenge Western-centric ideas of international relations?
For me, I think the most interesting aspect has to do with the fact that it turns the way IR, Orthodox IR, has been conceptualized, in which the emphasis is on great power politics. And this is telling us that international relations does not start, or neither should it end, with great power politics. Now, actually, we may learn a great deal by focusing much more on the non-powerful actors, or the so-called non-powerful actors within the international system, the oppressed part of it. And that's what I find it very fascinating. The second part of it is that also challenges this idea that we have to theorize for theory's sake, right? And then there's an attempt of us that we have to theorize with a clear view of changing the world. That's a kind of a normative kind of angle. So bringing the normative side into international politics. And the last one, which I find it very fascinating, is the idea that too much abstraction is a distraction. that it is for those who often would try to seek status quo, who often tend to go much more deeper into abstraction. And that, to some extent, is very fascinating because the lessons that we draw from post-colonialism is sometimes a little bit discomfort with empirical work and an attempt to theorize. Legon School of IR is actually, to some extent, suggesting to us that we have to be careful because that too much abstraction can be used as a strategy to prevent change from happening within the international, within the discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting the way that it's a materially grounded kind of school of thinking, and I think that also your point about, you know, it doesn't begin and end with the state, and actually that, you know, it tells us something about, you know, the way in which IR might think outside of the state, and that there were traditions that had done that well before the sort of cliched debates of you know, that we talk about in terms of Western IR. Tell me a little bit more. You talk about kind of Southern epistemologies. You talk about relational ontologies as a kind of way of thinking. I mean, you've talked about it sort of grounding in sort of normative and sort of more material concerns. As a way of thinking, how do these kind of Southern epistemologies, these relational ontologies, how might they help us with the project of decolonizing IR today?
Thank you so much. I think what it does is that I think this Southern epistemology, I think, draws our attention to the importance of inclusivity and equity in our thinking. I think, you know, the idea that we should be thinking much more about, you know, bringing in those that are oppressed within the society and making a conscious effort to think and theorize and center them. For me, I find it very fascinating in itself. And I also find the idea of placing the equitable distribution that are power or privilege at the center of scholarship as part of the Southern epistemology as also very interesting as well. But as I had already indicated, there's a cautionary tale for us, for those of us who want to do decolonial IR, right? It tells us that, I think the school is telling us that in most cases, if we want to do colonial IR, we have to be very careful that we don't also end up being exclusionalist in terms of the way we use the language that we use, and that we be much more inclusive, that if we tend to engage in too much abstraction, we tend to be much more exclusive, and to some extent, our work will be antithetical to the broader goal of trying to speak for or speak with the oppressed within the international system. That actually, I think, to me, is a very important part of it. And the last point that I would say is that it tells us that the best way to do decolonial IR, or the dismantle colonial episteme, and to create equitable oriented knowledge, is through a careful empirical analysis, which to some extent is very interesting, because if you go back to the third debate, the emphasis much more was on truth as a correspondent, was something that we were discouraged from pursuing, right? But this Legon School is telling us that I think actually we are better off going back and paying close attention to the empirical material. The idea of putting empirical research right at the center of scholarship is a very important part of, should be important part of IR, and that we may not be able just to do IR by just only theorizing.
Yeah, and I think the caution that you make about abstraction, I think, is really important there. And I think, you know, along with the colleagues that you published in the special issue with, you know, you make that point really well about going back to empirical kind of research to kind of show, precisely to include other voices for the normative reason of a more equitable and inclusionary discipline. I mean, I think, and I think this kind of article really is very strongly making that point. So I've got one kind of question left, which is sort of, what are you working on now? You mentioned that it's part of a bigger project, but what can we expect from you after this article now?
Yeah, there's one angle that I'm trying to develop. One is that I am so much interested in what kind of IR, or the way scholars thought about the international system prior to the colonial period. So I'm interested in looking at some of the manuscripts in places like Timbuktu and so forth. So the 15, 16, 16 and the 13th century, for example, how they thought about it and then trying to recover some of the ideas there. I'm also interested in pre-colonial African thinkers and whether there could be a Thomas Hobbes or a different version or Thucydides somewhere hidden somewhere on the African continent. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in. And as part of, I think one thing that didn't find itself in the article was this idea there was a much more emphasis on the so-called informal dimension of international politics. That international politics is not seen as a formal structure. And I want to really push this idea of bringing in the informal part of international politics at the center of our scholarship. So I'm working on those two. So those two I kind of research, and that's part of the reason why I'm out of Canada and just trying to understand what's so doing a lot of archival work, both in Addis Ababa and now I'm in Ghana doing, and then I'm hoping to go to Mali to also do some work, archival work, to see if I can find interesting work that existed during the pre-colonial period.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I mean, I think, you know, the article is a really interesting opening onto a much wider kind of set of sort of empirical historical concerns about, you know, a much more expansive kind of story. So it's not just about, and that's one of the things I find so fascinating about the article is it's not the kind of story about how did IR go to Africa, but it's actually about how do we recover stories about another IR with a Southern epistemology that tells a different story about the history of thinking about, you know, international systems and so on. So, I mean, that further research sounds absolutely fascinating. I look forward to reading it. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Congratulations again on winning the prize. I really encourage everybody to read Thomas's article. It's excellent.
Thank you for having me.